Please note that the Miami Book Fair does not end tomorrow. In fact, programs, events, activities take place throughout the entire year in Miami, and we're also grateful to Miami-Dade College and the hundreds of volunteers that helped to make this particular event possible. So there's going to be a brief, about 15-minute Q&A discussion at the end of the conversation here that Judith Miller will have with Tom Hudson. So prepare your questions. Think about your questions as they speak today. And then there's going to be a signing afterward as well. You're able to buy the book just to the right out these doors, and in the back over here as well. Fantastic. See everyone over there. You can buy the book right in the back. And then if you head just about 10 meters, 5-second walk to the right, there's going to be a table. Judith will be available there for the book signing. And then finally, I just ask you to kindly, if you haven't done so already, silence your cell phones. Please silence your cell phones so that there won't be any interruptions. And at this point, I'd ask you to help give me a very warm welcome to our introducer, Judge Jason Block, excuse me.
Morning, everybody. My name is Judge Jason Block, and I am a circuit court judge here in Miami-Dade County. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce today's session with Judith Miller and Tom Hudson. Tom Hudson is a journalist in his own right, and he'll be up taking the stage with Ms. Miller, and he'll be talking a little bit more about himself. Judith Miller is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, formerly with the New York Times. She won an Emmy for her work on a Nova New York Times documentary based on her articles for her book, Germs. She is the recipient of many awards, including among them the Society of Professional Journalists First Amendment Award for her protection of her sources, an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and a contributing editor of City Journal. Miller is a theater critic for Tablet Magazine. Since 2008, she has been a commentator for Fox News. In her latest book, The Story, A Reporter's Journey, published by Simon & Schuster, I've got my copy right here, Miller turns her journalistic skills on herself and her controversial reporting, which marshaled evidence that led America to invade Iraq. She writes about the mistakes she and others made on the existence in Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. She addresses the motives of some of her sources, including the notorious Iraqi Ahmed Chalabi and the CIA. She describes going to jail to protect her sources in the Scooter Libby investigation and the outing of CIA agent Valerie Plame, and how the Times subsequently abandoned her after 28 years. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. Hudson and Ms. Miller.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Hudson with WLRN. It's nice to see everybody out on a beautiful Saturday here at the Miami Book Fair International. And Judy, welcome back to Miami.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Formative years at Miami Beach and Nautilus Junior High.
Nautilus Junior High.
Yeah. My, how far the world has taken you since those days, Judy. Let's begin with this book. Is this book an apology?
I wouldn't say it's an apology. It's an exploration of error, mine, other people, as Judge Block said, and it's an effort to understand more about my own business. I mean, the amazing thing about journalism is that when you're in it, you don't have a lot of time to think about it and how it's done. And in jail, I had a lot of time to think about how it was done, and a lot of other things. So
you had 85 days to think about it,
yeah,
as a matter of fact.
Right. And it could have been a lot longer. So I got off easy.
For fear of offending Dale Carnegie, I'm going to read some descriptions that have been written about you. Hyper-ambitious, high-profile, attention-seeking, courageous, tenacious, blunt, defiant, disgraced.
The disgrace, I think, comes from the, believe it or not, public editor of the New York Times, who had never met me and never called me up, and who apparently didn't read her own paper's description of my departure and the praise that was heaped upon me by the publisher and everybody else. You know, one of the things that I explore in this book is false narratives. Things we all think we know, for sure. Who killed Kennedy? How did the World Trade Center come down? How did we go to war in Iraq? And I really believe that the "they lied, people died" bumper sticker about how we went to war in Iraq is a huge disservice to the country, to the intelligence agents who worked very, very hard to get it right and got it wrong, and to the journalists who were trying to get classified information, which, you know, you all know now, because we've seen too many examples of it. People go to jail for sharing. And I think that what I try to do is just look at these false narratives, how they're creative, how journalists ourselves help create these narratives. And my book is really dedicated to kind of trying at least to get my own view of what happened on the record.
To that end, as you've examined the false narrative that you participated in, were those mistakes avoidable given the hindsight that you have now?
I don't think so. I don't think so because of how I got the information and who I am, what I had done before. I had spent my whole life, I had been going to Iraq, since about, I think my first, whoops, I think my first,
I think we're picking up somebody else's signal there.
yeah,
It's the National Security Administration listening in.
Get your prizes.
should we try it again?
Yeah, go ahead, Judy, yes. So the question is, in hindsight, as you've examined the situation regarding weapons of mass destruction, your coverage in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, were those mistakes avoidable?
I don't think so, because I didn't get these stories that about WMD from the White House. Nobody picked up the phone and called me and said,
Guys, go Facebook.
have I got a story for you? And that would have been so much easier than the way I had to get these stories, which is, you know, people who talk about classified information usually do so only with the permission of their governments. And they have to take polygraphs all the time. And the first question, or the second question that's asked is, have you had any unauthorized contact with a member of the media? And that's what, so these people were taking a tremendous risk in talking to me. And these are the people, the men and women. They were not high profile. You may live next to them. You would never know it. But they were the ones who did the estimates, which led us to war, in part. I mean, it's a political decision, but it's also based on the president's belief that our country was in danger after 9/11, and that he was not going to be the president who witnessed a subsequent attack using WMD. That was his absolute conviction. And how do I know this? Not because I ever interviewed him. I have, to this day, have never met George Bush. But I know it from his book and from the people I interviewed about the decision. He was trying to protect the country, and he was relying on these estimates. So, you know, when I went back and I looked at the stories after they had turned out to be wrong, I said, what could I have done differently? Could I have said, oh, these intelligence analysts who are right about bin Laden, they warned me about bin Laden. They were right about the Soviet biological weapons program. They said the Soviets, the Russians are still cheating on the treaties they signed. They were right all along. They had track records. They knew me. They knew I'd go to jail to protect them. They said, trust us on this. Absolutely certain he's got WMD. 16 intelligence agencies told the president that. Am I supposed to say, yes, but Judy Miller thinks that there's no there there? I had been in Iraq. I had covered these programs. I had seen scientists tortured, put in jail until they agreed to work on them. I couldn't imagine why Saddam would not cooperate with the UN and do what he had pledged to do in order to get the sanctions lifted. Everything logically, evidentially led me and the analysts to believe that there was WMD there. So what was I supposed to do? What I wanted to do and what I always did was the minute I got a new piece of information that raised questions about what I'd written, I went back and I did another story. So the first most skeptical stories about the aluminum tubes that were supposedly involved in centrifuges for a nuclear program appeared in the New York Times, and they were written by me.
Right, under your byline.
Under my byline, but nobody remembers that. They just remember the first story that said the Bush administration believes that Saddam has an ongoing nuclear program. You know, I always try to put myself in the position of the other person when they're trying to tell me something. I always ask, why are they telling me this? What do they want? A lot of the men and women I dealt with, and by the way, women tend to do biology because real men do nukes, but men and women were convinced, and they were terrified for the country, and they had not a shred of doubt about this.
You write in this book, relying on the conclusions of American and foreign intelligence analysts and other experts I trusted, I too got weapons of mass destruction in Iraq wrong, but not because I lacked skepticism or because senior officials spoon-fed me a line.
Right.
So why?
Because they got it wrong, because they too...
They got it wrong.
Yeah, they knew Iraq. They had talked to scientists who claimed to have worked on the program. They believed that the country was in danger and that they had to look closely at the danger and what it was. This was a man who had violated 17 UN resolutions. He had pledged to come clean about why he had destroyed. He claimed to have destroyed material, but he presented no evidence. And in 2000, it wasn't until 2014 that the New York Times told its readers that American soldiers and Iraqis were being sickened by WMD that was still left over from the program that people were stumbling over by accident.
Was that enough to justify the reporting in 2000, 2001, and 2?
I never thought that that was the sole reason to go to war. The question I asked myself, and by the way, I didn't report on whether or not we should go to war. I had my own views, but it didn't interfere with my assessment of whether or not the analysts were correct. I really think that the weapons that we were finding were left over from the old program, the program he claimed to have destroyed. To me, his lying about them was the reason you contemplate war. Because if he's lying about that, what else is he lying about? Does he have sarin? Does he have anthrax? Does he have material that he's willing to give to terrorists so that he has no fingerprints if New York or Miami are hit with a WMD? That's what, that was the calculation they were making. I don't see how going back, how I could have written anything other than what I wrote. What infuriated me was that the Times didn't let me go back and do a full look at how the intelligence communities, and as a result, a lot of journalists, not just the Times, but the Post, every newspaper in the country, save one, got it wrong. And that's what we should have done. That's what newspapers should do. They go back and they should look at what we got wrong. The Times wasn't willing to do that, and that's why I left.
I want to ask you about that in a second, and we will have time for audience questions as well. But back to this, it feels like maybe a tautology that the intelligence was not coming from the White House that you were seeing. It was coming from career intelligence people.
Right.
But did you take it one step further? If it's coming from career intelligence people, are they getting it from another source inside the administration. Ultimately, your reporting was used by Vice President Cheney and others to justify military action in Iraq.
Reporting is always used by every administration to justify what they want to do. There was nothing new about that. It's the same pattern exists today. It's always going to happen, which is why you have to always inject as a third paragraph whatever skepticisms or contrary evidence you have. Because, politicians spin, politicians lie, fish swim. Oh my God. So you expect that. But I think you really need to look long and hard at premises. I think what I got wrong was I was unwilling to believe that Saddam would be so irrational as to do something that would be so contrary to his interests. That didn't make sense to me. And it didn't make sense to me that the intelligence communities would get it so wrong, because even though I knew they had gotten so much wrong for so long, on this, they were right. They had been right about Soviet biological weapons when there was a huge fight in the community and half of the intelligence agency said, no, the Soviets wouldn't dare take the chance of cheating. Turns out they had the biggest program in the world, 60,000 Soviet citizens working in facilities throughout the former Soviet Union, making horrible stuff, weaponizing Ebola, Marburg. We don't have vaccines. We didn't have antidotes to this stuff, and they were still weaponizing it. That, too, was counterintuitive, but they had a huge knockdown, drag-out. They finally got it right only after defectors came out and said, hey, that program you say doesn't exist? I work in it. So intelligence is complicated. It's very hard to get it right. But 3 independent panels, bipartisan, looked at the intelligence community's failure, and read those reports. To this day, they are stunning, and they ought to keep you awake at night. It says basically bad tradecraft, false, believing only accumulating the evidence that supported your point of view. Everything we're not supposed to do as analysts, they were doing. And my heart still bleeds for some of them, because these were really talented, committed people. And I share their pain, because they got it wrong. I got it wrong.
You discuss in the book about who got it wrong.
Yes, because some of them had died, and some of them gave me permission to tell their stories and how they got it wrong. And what just is amazing to me is that journalists and newspapers have not picked up on some of those people, have not gone to them and said, Judy Miller wrote this in the book. You're still trying to do this. Can you talk about this? There's been no interest because people don't want to believe. It's easier to believe that we lied than it is that we got it wrong. That's more painful and more difficult, I think, for people, many people.
Also for the media institutions?
Absolutely.
That got it wrong.
Absolutely.
And the journalists?
Yes.
Who got it wrong.
That's why writing this book was so tough, because I had to go back and say, could I have gotten this right? What did I get wrong? The thing that's ironic in retrospect is that I go back and I look at those stories, and the bottom line of the stories is wrong. The information in them is correct. The president did receive an intelligence document that said 99% chance he's got WMD, high confidence. For that, I'm pilloried, but for the thing for which I was praised, which is going to jail to protect a source, my testimony about the source was probably wrong. And that also was a huge kind of painful realization for me. And I thought, I have to set the record straight on that, even if it means that people may think that my going to jail was futile. You just do what you can do. The most important thing is not getting a story wrong. It's going back and doing it again and again until you approximate the truth.
I want to ask you about the contempt of court in that chapter in your career as well, but quickly on the weapons of mass destruction, you've talked about failures of the institution of journalism in this book, the failures of the institution of intelligence gathering. Why do you think you are the lightning rod of this? Are you singled out for this criticism.
I
of one who
was,
got it
since
wrong.
everybody was more or less writing the same thing. But I understand why, I think. And I explore it in the book. One, I worked for the New York Times. That was and remains, I think, the most influential newspaper in our country. And it is, by the way, a great newspaper and remains a vital institution in our democracy. I continue to have friends at the Times and enormous respect for the Times. But I think one, you know, it was the Times. I was writing for the Times. I was breaking news. I was making news. I was getting stuff about what the analysts were telling the president that no one else was getting.
But some of those articles were co-authored as well. You had co-authors
Yes.
and
Oh, yes.
co-investigators, but they
on more
they
than
were not,
half. That's right.
They have not
They
necessarily
were not.
been held
They
up.
were not held. And the third factor.
So why you?
I think partly a woman. You know, a very ambitious, as you said, dogged, determined.
I was quoting, by the way. I was quoting.
That's fine. You can say that. My husband says it all the time. That and why aren't you here? You're going where? But being a woman in a man's world, and boy, was this a man's world when I joined the Times. I mean, it was an amazingly chauvinistic place. And I guess they thought that I would, go off and do something that women do and cover.
And in fact, you were hired in part because of a court settlement
Yes.
regarding gender discrimination
Yes.
with the New York Times.
The New York Times settled, and when you look at some of the files and some of the complaints that women had at the Times, including paid discrimination, all of that was true, and that's why I got my job through affirmative action. I'm an affirmative action baby, so.
What would you say to President George W. Bush?
If
You
I ever
mentioned
met him.
You mentioned you haven't met him.
No, I haven't met him, and I didn't meet Dick Cheney until after he had left office. So this notion of being spoon-fed by the White House and White House aides, would that have been nice? No. I think I'd say to George Bush, he's such a complicated man, and I really urge you to read his book, which is, it got very bad reviews, and yet it's an amazing book. It's self-revelatory. He talks about the decision to go to war. I think I'd say to him, I applaud that decision because I think it was a very tough one, and I'm sure he did it, was acting on what he thought were the best interests of the country. I think I'd want to ask him, more than tell him, why did you get the conduct of the war, the implementation of the war so wrong? Why did you let it go on for so many years when we were losing this war? And every year I went to Iraq and I embedded with forces and I saw the losses and the injuries and my friends whom I kept in the military, whom I kept following all the way through. I saw what happened to them. I'd say, why did you let this go on for so long? And then finally, why did you have the courage when so many of your advisors, including your Secretary of State, said, don't do the surge, including senior military people, we'll never win, Iraq can't be turned around. Where did the courage come from to make the decision to do the surge and stabilize Iraq? When I left Iraq in 2010, and my last mission with the soldiers, the last embed, was in Anbar province, where ISIS now is. When I left, it wasn't a happy-go-lucky kumbaya kind of place, but it was stable, and we had stabilized Iraq. And to watch it all fall apart after that is truly heartbreaking for someone who cares about the Iraqi people and thinks they've been through 40 years now of real pain and suffering.
Constant conflict, yeah. If folks want to line up for questions, we'll get to them here. I've got one final question, because you write about memory, and you've mentioned faulty memories and false narratives here, even in our conversation. You write about it, especially regarding the Plame affair, and where you spent 85 days in jail for contempt of court for not handing over your notes and discussing confidential conversations that you had with a source. I want to go back to your first book that you wrote, One by One by One, which is an account, or not an account, but it is an examination of the Holocaust. This was written in 1990, and you wrote, quote, I have tried to explore the way different people have tried to distort, to justify, to erase memories of the Holocaust, and how some have tried to use them to rationalize the past. Fast forward 15 years, and it feels like are you writing that same kind of rationalization in this book?
You know, I am. my work is all about two things: evil and how we digest it or confront it or minimize our failure to do so. That's what interests me. I think right now we're in a truly civilizational struggle, just as we were during World War II, between evil and, if not good, certainly better than the alternative. And we need to make this fight. We don't have any choice. People who not only take pride in beheading fellow human beings, but videoing what they do and encouraging others to do it, that's my definition of evil. Just like putting people in gas ovens is my definition of evil. Just like cutting up reporters into little pieces the way Saddam did and delivering their parts to their families and making them pay for the box, that too is evil. And it's incumbent on all of us to think about evil and to think about how we remember what we did or failed to do in confronting it. That has been, thank you, Tom, for just kind of putting bookends on my reporting career and my life. It obsesses me.
Let's open up to questions. Go ahead, sir.
Ms. Miller, in your reporting, I understand that you were the conduit for the lower level intelligence people reporting, confessing to you, rather than this information coming from the White House. Was the lower level intelligence people, was it unanimous, or did you run across dissenting opinions? Because the impression seemed to be unanimous at the time of the reporting.
It's an excellent question. There was one agency, the smallest agency, the intelligence unit of the State Department, called Intelligence and Research, INR. The head of that agency was an old friend of mine who I had covered because we shared a passion for arms control and for weapons of mass destruction. His analysts doubted that Saddam, they did not doubt that Saddam had WMD. They signed on to the conclusion with high confidence that he did. They took issue with the aluminum tubes. They said, we don't think these tubes show that he had a nuclear program. But they didn't dispute the bottom line. But there were people, there were analysts there were fierce fights. There always are. There were fierce fights about the intelligence and how to interpret it. But I said to Carl Ford, who headed this unit afterwards, some of your analysts were right. Why didn't you let me talk to them? And that's one of the things I do in the book, is confront him with other people who were hawkish. I got permission to talk to, or they wanted to talk to me, but the doves, the people who were skeptical, wouldn't or didn't. And I said to you, Carl, you knew me. We'd worked together for a long time. I'd covered you for a long time. Why didn't you tell me? He said, I have this old-fashioned view that my intelligence should go to the Secretary of State and the President, and that people who take an oath not to talk to the press should not do so. So people didn't cooperate or didn't express doubts for a wild variety of reasons. And that was one reason I wanted to go back and say to them, you had doubts, you were right. Why weren't you more vocal? And I got some very interesting stories, some of which I couldn't even put in the book about why they did that. Other people who died, I think once they die, I can write about what they thought and who they were. So I have some of those stories too, but it was very complex. It always is. I could just tell you that the only thing I would advise as somebody who's been through this process and has gotten it wrong is be very skeptical of everything you read, everything you see, and the more certain someone is about the information they're telling you, the more doubts you ought to have because it's very hard to get, especially intelligence information right, really hard.
Go ahead, ma'am.
I was reminded of the UN inspections. Would you speak to the chronological order of that with your information and intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Some of my best sources were actually the UN inspectors, and once again, one of them who committed suicide, was so tortured by what happened. He was a Brit. He was not even an American. His name was David Kelly, and he committed suicide when I came back from Iraq in June of 2003. These people, they are, I'm sorry.
The UN inspectors.
The UN inspectors also got it wrong. They did not get it right. Hans Blix, in his own book, says he thought that Saddam was hiding WMD, but what he wanted was more time to either prove or disprove it. And the Americans wouldn't give him that because George Bush wanted to go to war before it got unspeakably hot. And why did he want to go to war in that? Because he knew that our soldiers were going to be wearing full chemical suits or gas masks. And having spent time in one, I can tell you they are really, really hot, and you don't want to fight in that weather. Now, if he knew that Saddam really didn't have WMD, why would he give anthrax vaccinations to every soldier who went to Iraq? Why would he demand that we all kept those gas masks, reporters and the soldiers that we covered, by their beds? Your rifle, which of course I didn't have, and a gas mask, because he was so certain that we were going to be hit with chemical weapons.
And I think the chronological question that you had
Is
there's of course, yeah, when the Secretary of State Colin Powell went to the United Nations, held up the satellite photography, the before and after, that was trying to show to the world community the evidence that I think you're discussing.
Right.
And then it was March of 2003 when the military action on the ground began.
Right. That, I think his speech was in February, if I recall correctly. And I remember some of my UN friends sitting around saying, I don't know, this evidence seems a little thin to us. But there was also stuff that he presented that hadn't been shared with them. And we were supposed to be sharing everything with the inspectors, but actually most of the information that I got, or a lot of it, came from the UN and not from American sources at all, which is one of the ironies of this "they lied, people died" meme.
Go ahead, sir. Good morning.
You obviously have thought a lot about journalism and its future. It scares me that all the things you're recommending can't happen with this 24-hour news cycle when a journalist puts out a story that they haven't checked or double-checked because it has to be on in 30 seconds. What's going to happen to journalism?
Oh boy, this is a tough audience who'd ask good questions. I worry about that every day. I mean, I worry about the rush to be first, especially with 24-hour news cycles. You know, the kind of reporting I did on Al-Qaeda, that took me 2 years to do. It must have cost the Times millions of dollars. We had a team of 6. I went to them in 1999 and I said, you know this guy Osama bin Laden, 99, this is long before 2001. I said, this guy is dangerous and he's dangerous to us and we've got to trace him everywhere. They spent 2 years, they gave me 2 years. Now I was doing other things too, but doing a series of like 15 articles that won the Pulitzer, because we published it in January of 2001, 9 months before 9/11, saying, you know this Al-Qaeda group, you've never heard of them? Really bad guys, they're out to get us. 50,000 Arabs trained in their camps, working on chemical weapons, which they were, working on biological weapons, which they had just started to do. No one paid attention to that after the Times. The New York Times did front page story after front page story. You know, after the fact, I got a Pulitzer. It's a Pulitzer I would have preferred my team and I not to have had to have won. But there is no greater danger right now to journalism than 2 things. One, opinion journalism masquerading as factual, because even the New York Times has stopped distinguishing on its front page. And 2, this kind of rush to get the story first, we'll correct it later if it's wrong. Those are pressures. There's another pressure. We can't make it work financially anymore. Our papers are disappearing. Do you know how many newspapers have bureaus in Paris? 1 week ago, when this thing happened, a handful of news organizations were in a position to cover Paris, and the terrible events there on the ground, because most have shut down their bureaus all over the world because we can't afford them. So the kind of reporting that I've done, that I did, papers and even networks can no longer afford to do. They won't do it because it's too expensive. That's why I am deeply worried about the future of my profession, and another reason that I wrote the story. Thank you for the question.
Good morning, ma'am. Go ahead.
Mine actually is almost a continuation of that discussion. How was your feelings or what you experienced when you were let go from the newspaper and then into your next part of your career? That's like a huge.
Right. I write about this. I wasn't let go. I left. I decided I was kind of pushed out. They made me an offer I could have refused, but I wouldn't have been happy remaining
Negotiated
there.
departure,
Negotiated
I believe is the
departure.
phrase.
But I was never fired because I hadn't done anything wrong. And if I'd wanted to stay, I could have. But I just didn't want to stay at an institution that wouldn't be honest about itself and its own missteps in the reporting. I felt I didn't want to be part of that. But going to TV and going to new journalism has been a huge shift because I never cared about what I looked like. No one ever cared about what I looked like. Now, look, TV is a very visual medium, and what you look like matters. It matters in terms of being authoritative. And what I can do now, because I'm a commentator, is offer opinions. Fox News actually wants to know what I think. And they have never told me, despite my very liberal views on many social issues, most social issues, they have never told me not to say something or not to speak out about something. The New York Times had many, many rules about what I could speak about, what I couldn't speak about. So for me, this has kind of been liberating. And it's been wonderful to work with such a professional group of people. Fox News does label its opinion. What you see during the day on Fox News is news. What you see at night with O'Reilly and Hannity and Megyn Kelly, that is labeled as opinion. And they're entitled to their opinions. And they even have me on. So they clearly wanted at times an opposing view.
I got to just ask a quick follow here. Compare, contrast, ideology, New York Times, Fox News. I can't imagine a broader perspective here.
Now, I'm going to say something that's going to shock a lot of people in this room. There is a broader diversity of opinion, real political opinion, at Fox News than there was at the New York Times.
On the air, published, AKA, or in the newsroom?
In the newsroom. Most of the people in the newsroom of the New York Times, as in my profession, would self-identify as liberal or Democrat. 78% of my profession now identifies themselves as Democrats. What does that tell you about a Republican point of view? At Fox, I have friends who are Republicans, who are Democrats, who are libertarians, who don't talk to the more mainstream. Everybody talks to everybody, but there is a huge diversity of opinion there. There's gay, there's straight, there's liberal, there's conservative, and it's all welcome. And whereas at the Times, people tended to reflect one point of view. And it was a point of view that for the most part I shared, so I wasn't even aware of it until I left it and realized, hey, it's a big wide world with a lot of people thinking different things out there.
Sometimes the fish don't see the water.
Yes, I didn't
We've
say
got about
I
4
was
minutes
swimming
left.
in
Go
it.
ahead, ma'am.
I appreciate all your journalistic work, and I'm looking at your definition of evil, which could include invading another country and destroying their government and infrastructure and everything. And I've been reading that ISIS and what we're dealing with now is a result of totally destroying the structure in that country. And I'd like you to address this, and also the fact that it seems like a lot of the reporting lacks any kind of historical context. It's just like the most recent action. And I also heard you say that you it seems like a simplistic choice of if they do have WMDs, maybe then we should go to war. It seems like there should be more options than that. Could you talk about
There are so many interesting questions in that question, and one of them, one of them is the big fight on WMD within the government was not whether or not he had it. The big fight was whether or not it was worth going to war, even if he had it. And believe me, that was a huge debate within the Bush administration, and people were on all sides. And when I go back and look at the reporting, you were reading that. You were reading about that debate. That debate was covered by the New York Times and other papers. Perhaps not as much as it should have been, but it was covered. Evil, invading another country, is sometimes evil and it's sometimes not. It always results in death and destruction, which is why it's such a hard call. But where there are moments when you either don't have a choice or you feel you don't have a choice. There is the concept of just war. I think World War II was without a doubt a just war. We were attacked. We didn't have a choice. We had a choice on whether or not we could have gotten involved earlier, and many people might have been saved.
Is this more vague concept of a war on terrorism just in your definition?
Oh, absolutely. Perhaps we shouldn't call it that, but that's their tactic, and it's hard to go to war against a tactic, but we're not going to war against a tactic. We're going to war, and we have been at war for many years, which brings me back to the first part of your question, against the people who practice this tactic. ISIS was not created by George Bush and his invasion. May I simply remind you that ISIS's grandparent is Al-Qaeda. We were hit in 9/11 by Al-Qaeda long before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. 2003 invasion of Iraq might have stemmed from 9/11 and been justified by our fear about what might happen to us. But I don't think ISIS is the result of the invasion of Iraq. It is a result of the mishandling of the war, of the fact that not only did George Bush mishandle the war, but Barack Obama was handed a stabilized country and then decided to honor his campaign pledge to withdraw all forces, even when his generals and military told him not to do so, that this would not end well. He disregarded that advice to honor his pledge to the American people. But it has been a disastrous decision for them. Once we left, all hell broke loose in Iraq, and President Maliki didn't feel he had to pay attention to us. We had no leverage. Look, we still have forces all over the world. I've just been in South Korea. We have 30,000 men and women sitting on the DMZ, ready to go to, we're the tripwire there. We have forces in Germany, in Japan, in South Korea. Why not keep forces in Iraq when so many people had died to make that country stable? Now, that's my political view. I could not have expressed that view at the New York Times. I can express it now at Fox, which is one reason why I chose to go there.
Sir, we'll let you get the last question in here in our remaining moments.
How much funding is ISIS or ISIL getting from Saudi Arabia? And also to remind people that 3/4 of the people of 9/11 were Saudis.
Right, and there are 25 still classified pages of the 9/11 Commission report. That, by the way, to this day, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to go back and read a good analysis of why we are where we are, go back and read the 9/11 Commission report. But 25 pages that highlight Saudi funding of the very groups that we're now fighting. I can just tell you, having worked in Saudi Arabia for so long, that they have now had a rude awakening. When Riyadh began to look like the OK Corral because people, their own progeny, were shooting and blowing things up, they understood what they had done. And they have very slowly but surely begun to turn their policy around. But the damage they have done is extensive, and we are dealing with the results of that damage. But I will say this about having covered the Middle East and Islam for so long. This war within Islam between people who believe that the words of the Prophet must be followed absolutely and without deviance and without reinterpretation, versus those who say time moves on, Mohammed would have changed his view about things too. That war is as old as Islam itself. We did not cause it. We sometimes side with one group or another, our support for Saudi Arabia or our support to liberate Iraq. But this is an age-old struggle within the religion. And one of my heroes, for all of his faults, which are many, including putting journalists in jail, is the only Arab leader who had the guts to say, Islam, my religion, needs a reformation, is the president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, whom President Obama did not have the time to meet when he came to the UN and was begging to speak to him about the fight that he's been fighting against ISIS in his own country. So I have a lot of problems with our foreign policy. I think this fight against ISIS, against barbarians who would take us back to a world without joy and music and freedom and interpretation, is a good fight. It's a moral fight. It's an essential fight. And that's why I wrote the book, The Story.
The Story, A Reporter's Journey. How about it for Judith Miller? Thank you, Judith.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to wrap up this fascinating conversation by reminding you that Judith will be available immediately out to the right at a table for signing. I do have her purse, so she's coming with me. Okay? And thank you very much for coming to this discussion. Have a great day.